Good morning. I'm Stapleton Roy. My name is Stapleton Roy. I'm the director of the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. The Kissinger Institute is one of the three sponsors of this program this morning, the others being the China Environment Forum here at the Wilson Center and the Program on America and the Global Economy. For those of you who are not familiar with the Wilson Center, just a brief word. It was created by Congress in 1968 as a memorial to the only American president who had a PhD and who was actually a scholar. So I think it's one of the nicest memorials in Washington because it is a practical expression of President Wilson's ability to bring the world of academia and the world of public policy together. And basically, this is the focus of the programs here at the Wilson Center. Our program is the launch of Terry Cook's new book on sustaining U.S. China cooperation in clean energy. This is a very important topic. The United States and China are the two largest emitters of greenhouse gases in the world. If we aren't able to work together, it will be impossible to get a credible international program for addressing the problems of global warming and clean energy, the two being connected to each other. You have the program, which contains biographic material on the speakers. So I'm not going to run through their backgrounds in detail. But I would like to say that Dr. Cook has been working on clean energy issues for many years. He spent a year here at the Wilson Center 2 years ago, or barely over a year ago, I guess. And this is the product of his period here. He has looked at the issue in detail, and I look forward to hearing his conceptualization of the research that went into producing this book. He's also, he's located in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia is playing a very interesting role in trying to establish cooperative programs with China, specifically between Philadelphia and Tianjin in China, dealing with clean energy issues. He's the founder of a nonprofit organization that is trying to mobilize activities in Philadelphia to address these issues in cooperation with China. And President Obama has established a clean energy hub in Philadelphia, which is part of this process. Dr. Wekesser is also very experienced in dealing with China. He's the CEO of a consulting firm that works with firms interested in operations in China. He's been involved in the development of electric cars in China. Is that?
Well, we did a study of it. I wasn't involved in the development of it.
Okay. Well, a study is part of the development process. So he is, has also been associated with clean energy issues involving China. Terry, let me turn the floor over to you, and then Dr. Wekesser, we'll look forward to your comments on Terry's presentation.
Thank you, and I'll use the podium so I can look at the slides and remind myself what I'm saying. Well, good morning. I'd like to start with a sincere word of appreciation for the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'll be sharing with you a little bit of a background of what Stape called the conceptualization of this book project and how I came to be involved with it. But I want to point out that the ability to have a home in a place like the Woodrow Wilson Center, to be able to use people like Stape Roy and his recently retired deputy, Douglas Spellman, as sounding boards and mentors through the process, to have support of people like Sandy Foe, who did a lot of the heavy lifting of helping get this book to publication, and to be able to work with the interns and the facilities that this place provides is really exciting, and I'm profoundly grateful. So, U.S. China Clean Energy is on the front pages of Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, several times a week. It's difficult to remember back to the beginning of the Obama administration, because the previous administration, being headed by someone from an oil and gas state, had very little developed in the way of a strategic outreach program to the other biggest carbon dioxide emitter in the world, China. Together, the two countries, as Dave referenced, account for more than 40% of global greenhouse gases. And without a aligned effort to deal with it on a global basis, there really is not much prospect of progress being made globally. The incoming Democrats had really prepared a plan to give to the arsenal of they believed it would likely be Hillary Clinton. It turned out to be President Obama. But they wanted to put a second track of policy towards China to go alongside the currency exchange discussion that the Treasury Department had been running for 8 years under the leadership and the chairmanship of Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson. And they borrowed, I'm not sure if they explicitly borrowed this, but almost at a spiritual level, they borrowed the gist of Tom Friedman's book, Hot, Flat, and Crowded, and they seized upon the idea of cooperation in clean energy as a way to reboot the economic relationship. The Democrats had taken great pride under the previous Clinton administration in helping bring China into the World Trade Organization. And so they saw clean energy as an opportunity to revive a win-win aspect of the bilateral relationship to run in parallel to the win-lose topic of currency exchange. So that's the background. Personally, I was coming from having been a background with the U.S. Foreign Senior Service as a commercial officer. My wife and I had relocated back to the U.S. in 2003. And then for a couple of years, in 2006 to 2008, I'd been a director with the World Economic Forum. And because I was a director in charge of Asia, I had the opportunity to sit in on industry-level discussions at Davos in a number of different areas: finance, auto, telecommunications. And I was struck when I was listening to the peer CEOs talking among themselves how deeply and obviously committed they all were to using clean energy as a way of transforming their business models. They were not talking about clean energy as a PR and marketing effort. They were talking about it as a fundamental transformer of their business models. And there was really not anyone in those rooms who was not talking actively about that. When I left the World Economic Forum, I decided I wanted to focus on this area. So I had both the advantage of the background of having been in contact with that network of CEOs, and then the timing advantage that in 2009, this area was beginning to open up as a new set of Obama administration policies. So to help give you some idea of the conceptualization of the projects, I just want to mention 3 simple points. And I would like to mention that James Gibney, who's there in the middle, recently with Atlantic Monthly and now with Bloomberg View, it was actually James who gave me the idea to approach the Woodrow Wilson Center with this project, and James, I'm grateful for that suggestion. So at the time I started with this, starting thinking about it in 2009 and then starting working on it in 2010, there were really 2 types of information. There was almost a overabundance of types of information that are pictured on the left of this slide. That is a Fast Company headline and it reads, infographic, how China's clean tech industry crushes the US. And down in the graphic, why China is kicking our ass in clean tech. That's representative of a type of reporting that happens frequently in daily industry reporting, in daily mass media reporting, in business periodicals. It's information that is generally true, generally without any type of context, and is focusing in on a issue which probably helps sell newspapers, but it provokes some level of anxiety. On the other side of the spectrum is a type of information which there are literally board feet. You could take this entire desk space here and just line up books, many of which are produced by the US government, many of which are technical in nature, and very few of which people read. This one in particular is the U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission did a 600-page publication called China's Green Energy and Environmental Policies. Some excellent information in there, but not information that really gets out to the public particularly effectively. So with the conceptualization of this project, I wanted to aim squarely for the middle of those two types of information. I have no technical background in any particular area of clean energy, but having worked with the US government for 15 years and then at the World Economic Forum, I was emboldened to try to talk about something that I did not know a great deal about, but I had access to experts who would tell me about it. And it would help overcome the gap because there are wind energy experts who have brilliant insights about their sector, but they are hesitant to say anything about solar or anything about hydro because it's not their acknowledged area of expertise. The second area of conceptualization I've really just touched on already. Because I'm not a technical expert, I consciously needed to think through the perspectives that I was trying to bring to bear to the book, and there are really four major ones. My original academic training was as a cultural anthropologist at the University of California, a PhD program. And from that point on, I did 4 tours in the Foreign Service in Shanghai, Tokyo, Berlin, and Taipei. Did the 2-year directorship with the World Economic Forum. And then, as Stape mentioned a moment ago, over the last 2 years, I've been involved with the regional group in Philadelphia called the China Partnership of Greater Philadelphia. And those are the 4 perspectives that I tried to bring to bear with this book. And then finally, there are some excellent call to action publications about U.S. China clean energy written by associations and lobbying groups generally within the Beltway. One characteristic of those is that they tend to put all their information through what I call a policy blender. They are written by policy groups for policy reasons, and all of the information in the publication is essentially reflecting a policy prism. I, as a person outside the Beltway, chose to do it slightly differently. I believe that in economic and commercial policy, there are 3 major ingredients. One is the political background, a second is the technology background, and then third and very importantly is the investment background, because if a technology does not attract a sufficient amount of energy to scale the technology, then it's irrelevant what is happening with that technology in the policy sphere. All 3 elements have to be interacting together to get policy traction. And it's useful to look at the technology dynamics globally and to look at the investment dynamics globally without really reference to policy, wished for policy outcomes, but just to look at them and describe them in their own right. So, In the book, I do look first at the U.S. the U.S. political background. And with this audience who lives and breathes U.S. politics, I'm not going to try to do that today. I'm going to try to use my time just on a few select points. But let me share two observations about the political background to the U.S. China clean energy from a Chinese perspective. And this is consciously trying to bring in some of the perspective of a cultural anthropologist. When we think about the opportunity to partner effectively with China towards a global solution in clean energy, it's very important to have some dim awareness of China as a potential partner, what their motivations are. What are they looking for? And in the first place, China approaches the whole area of clean energy technology in an extremely different way from the US. It is not primarily something that is good for the world, that addresses climate change. It is something that has to do with the long-term survival and viability of the Chinese Communist Party, for which the government apparatus is the pinnacle of that entire apparatus is, of course, the CCP. With 9.8% growth sustained for a 30-year period since the initial opening of economic reforms by Deng Xiaoping in 1982, there is an extraordinary demand on the Chinese system for the raw material energy inputs to sustain that growth. It's a truism that we don't need to spend time on, but as the CCP has jettisoned Marxist-Leninist ideology since 1982 in favor of its street cred with Chinese citizens is coming from its ability to deliver the economic goods. The challenge of supplying increasing amounts of energy to feed that level of growth is really quite daunting. So from that perspective, it is not a either-or approach to developing energy sources in China. It's not that, okay, we'll do a lot of wind turbines and that will allow us to decommission coal plants. They are decommissioning coal plants, but it's not because they are putting in wind power. They're decommissioning coal plants because they're putting in new coal plants, and they are, every lever of energy development in China is essentially at full forward. So that's one issue. It's not either or, it's both and. They are currently importing the greatest amount of foreign oil that they ever have in their life. Even though oil production figures are falling in China, they're continuing to aggressively try to exploit those sources. Even in the wake of Fukushima, they're going forward with nuclear. They're the most active program and large-scale program of installing across the board the whole raft of alternative energy and renewable energy sources, biomass, wind, solar. And then the second point that I would like to make about the political motivations in China is what is good energy and what is bad energy. Again, it is not really determined ultimately by let's say an American NGO viewpoint, or we could call that the UN COP process for green energy. It's really more determined by an energy security calculus. Energy that you can put your foot on in the words of one Chinese official quoted in my book, is good energy. Energy that comes from outside the country, over which the Chinese government has less ultimate control, is not good energy. Currently, they rely on both, but the strategic goal is to reduce the dependence on energy that they can't put their feet on, and to increase their access to energy that they can put their feet on. So that means that the renewable class of energy is favored, because you put the turbine on your land, you do the hydroelectric generators on your rivers, you do the photovoltaic ultimately, and we'll get to that in your own country. So it's really more of a energy security motivated approach. The other point I wanted to make about Chinese politics is something that everyone knows, but I would suggest almost everybody underappreciates. This is the plan that is hiding in plain sight. The other handle for it would be China's 5-year planning process. Since 1982, China, with extreme methodicalness, has started in the south, and they have developed 3 growth engines for China's development. I won't belabor this because people are familiar with the general outlines of this, but the key element of Deng Xiaoping's reform in 1982 was looking over at Hong Kong and figuring that to boost China's growth, they needed to replicate those conditions over the border in China. Took a fishing village, Shenzhen, and has made it over the last 30 years into the 102nd largest and most vibrant city in the world. Before doing the each rung of the ladder that China has climbed over the last 30 years, I just want to step back for a second and kind of talk about how this works. The Chinese leadership is acutely realistic about what they need for their country's development. They've been saying it to anyone who would listen for the last 30 years. They need technology, they need capital, and they need expertise. In developing China with these growth engines, with their 5-year plan process, they recognized that they didn't have the capital to do it themselves. They were going to be relying on foreign direct investment, and in fact, China's economy has historically been the most foreign direct investment reliant major economy in the world. What they did is no different, though at a larger scale. It's no different than at Christmas time when you walk down Fifth Avenue, and at Saks Fifth Avenue, there is a jaw-dropping window display. It's a window display that is so compelling that a crowd gathers around it. And if you were walking down the street and had no intention of even stopping, the fact that there's such a crowd there tends to make you stop and make you look at the window. And people who look at the window, there's a large percentage of those people who end up going into the store. Any store owner knows that you can never get a customer to get money out of their pocket if they're standing on the sidewalk. But if you get them to go in the door, the chances are excellent that they're going to leave money behind. That is what this plan, in essence, is. It's a shop or show window for China. And there were 3 of them, and they were built in successive 10-year periods. Shenzhen during the 1980s. That worked well, and then when my wife and I and my newly born son Todd were in Shanghai, after things got slow in Tiananmen, the Shanghai municipal officials knocked on our door at the consulate. It was the only time they ever visited us. We normally had to go to their offices to meet with them. But they laid out blueprints for Pudong, which was rice fields at that time. And they said, we're going to do that. And Ambassador Jim Lilly and our team spent the remaining 4 months that I was in Shanghai trying to figure out how much of this information to report back to Washington and how much credibility to give it, because the scale of the plan was so immense that it invited a certain disbelief, but the fact of what the Chinese had achieved previously in Shenzhen suggested that it be taken seriously. And then currently, in the 21st century, this is happening again. Slight variations, because China's development has proceeded apace. But in Tianjin, just about 35 minutes by high-speed rail from Beijing to the east, Tianjin is the beneficiary of the third program. And there's, to wrap this up, there's just an interesting point about this, which was very much a conscious element of the Chinese planners. Each one of these locations, one in the south, one in the central region of the country, and one in the north, is on a major waterway. The idea is to get 2 bites of the economic apple from foreign direct investment. The showcase city itself attracts gargantuan levels of foreign direct investment, but then the economic benefits of that growth in the showcase city disseminate along traditional waterways to reach a much larger hinterland. So Shenzhen is on the Pearl River, Pudong is on the Yangtze River, and Tianjin is on the Bohai Bay. So in each case, there is a dissemination and spreading effect. Now, switching to technology. My book looks at roughly 10 different sectors. It does simple compare and contrast of the dynamics in, let's say, the U.S. solar industry, and then of the Chinese solar industry. And the idea behind that contrast and compare methodology is to identify areas where, just on really a common sense level, it's clear that either cooperation is going to be possible in that area, or cooperation will not be possible. I'll talk very quickly about 3 of those 10. I suspect there may be questions that will give us a chance to go a little bit deeper into each of them. I'm going to take 2 that are problematic areas, where we have a lot of competitive pressure currently between the U.S. and China, but are meat and potatoes sectors within the portfolio of renewable energy and clean energy. Let me start with wind. In the wind industry really developed almost like the civil aviation industry globally, with national champions in a small number of countries. So the first was really Denmark, with Vestas as their national champion. The Spanish came along with Gamesa. The U.S. was led by GE. Germany got into the game with Siemens. And so during the late 70s, 80s, 90s, the global market was dominated by those players. China, by the late 1990s, early 2000s, was interested in the long-term potential of the wind energy market, and they invited foreigners in for installations. Vestas was the most energetic of the companies that came in, and between 2000 and 2005, Vestas had a really positive experience and captured over 35% of the Chinese market for wind turbine installations in the country. By this time, there was a 5-year plan calling for installations. Then in the year 2005, there was a change, and China introduced a set of regulations that all wind installations were going to require upwards to an 80% level of local sourced inputs to the total value of the installation. And because companies are averse to losing very lucrative markets, Vestas essentially went along with this for 5 years. And in order to reach those 80% targets of locally sourced value, they did very effective training programs for engineers, and they helped develop parts suppliers in China. And by 2010, it produced the following quite extraordinary situation. From the period 2005 to 2010, Vestas's dollar sales rose. So far, so good. However, in that same period, Vestas's share of the Chinese market fell from over 35% to less than 3%. And what that shows is the scale and speed with which China's market can develop. It was not WTO consistent. The U.S. and others filed complaints with the WTO, and in 2010, on kind of the 11th hour and 59th minute before an adverse finding was going to be announced by the WTO, China settled, but it did take the WTO mechanism close to 3-4 years to influence China's behavior, and in that 3-4 years, market facts on the ground were substantially changed. All right, switching to solar. In our discussions in the US, there's sometimes a little bit of a tendency to lump Chinese practices in solar with Chinese practices in wind, perhaps because there's a sense that there is something not quite fair going on in both. But the first thing I'd like to say is that it's important to really understand what the facts on the ground are, and it's a very different dynamic going on between the two markets. That entire wind market story is about installations in the China market. The solar story is actually the flip side of that, because until very recently, I really brought my book to a close in terms of the data and the facts at the end of 2011. There was no sizable market of solar installation in China at that time. Now that sounds anomalous. Why? China is pedal to the metal in all clean energy sectors. Why isn't the government has the will and the resources and the capacity to build out solar that could be bringing new renewable energy sources into the grid? What's going on? Well, what's going on is Asia in general and China in particular has long been the natural manufacturing base for some related technologies such as DRAM memory chips in the IT business. The panels are not wildly dissimilar from manufacturing chips. And China, through its relationships with Taiwan manufacturers and its own manufacturers because there's not a huge barrier to entry in PV, photovoltaic solar panel manufacturing. The Chinese jumped into that in a big way. There are actually currently more than 100 solar manufacturers in the city of Dezhou, Shandong, just one city. But all of that manufacture has been destined for export markets. None of it has really been going into China. And why is that? Well, the Chinese planners are extremely shrewd, and they are realistic, and they have their eye on a goal. The buying of solar panels up until the global financial crisis in September 2008 was largely driven by government subsidies that were given by the Spanish government, the German government, and to some extent by state governments and some IRS national tax preferences to consumers in the US. And the Chinese saw an opportunity to develop their manufacturing industry by selling to those customers, to help their industry overcome some of the challenges to the industry. There was a shortage of the key input polysilicon at one point. Wall Street Journal did a nice article on how the Chinese government sprang into action and cornered a large supply of polysilicon for their suppliers. And then again, with a questionable WTO approach, Chinese government subsidized their manufacturers to be producing. Normally, WTO encourages subsidies on the consumer side, but not on the manufacturing side. So all of this has resulted in a bit of a casino mentality in China for manufacturing and exporting solar panels. The net effect has been that it's caused extraordinary price pressure on competitors who are manufacturing solar panels in the US and in Europe. I ended the narrative for my book, as I mentioned, September 2011, but I predicted that there would be trade actions in the solar area, which there have, in fact, now been a series of WTO challenges. It'll probably be a few years before those challenges force a decision with China, but what will have happened whenever that decision is made? I would predict to this audience that the decisions will be against China. China will step back, and it will stop what it had been doing. But the price of a PV panel will have fallen probably by 90%. And what China will have achieved is it will start building out its own domestic industry with solar installations, and they'll be doing it at 1/10 of the price that they would have been paying had they done it differently. And the point that I'd like to make is that if one steps back and thinks about this broadly, the Chinese are showing an ability to, quote unquote, game a system of international rules that was constructed in the post-World War II period with institutions like the WTO and the IMF. They're very aggressive in what they do. They're very focused in what they do. But they are playing by those rules. And when findings are found against them, they generally do step back. Under their current 5-year plan, they have a goal to influence those set of rules more effectively than they have in the past. They've kind of received those rules. But I think it would be good in the US political debate if we bear in mind that China only joined in 2001, that they lean over the line Sometimes they overstep the line, but when it's pointed out, they will generally pull back. And there are alternatives in terms of the global system that could be much worse than that. And they are able to leverage their scale and speed as a society, top-down decision-making, in a way that makes it, it's a new event for the community of international nations to kind of be dealing with a entity that is so fast-growing, has so much scale at its disposal, and can move at such speed. But it's a little bit incumbent on us to recognize what's going on, recognize that it's technically within the rules of the game, and to figure out an appropriate response on our part to make things work for everybody. One quick question. This is an interactive portion of my talk, and I don't expect anyone to have a right answer, but I hope there'll be somebody who will be bold enough to hazard a guess. Who can guess, just order of magnitude, how many installations of wind turbines the single U.S. company GE has in China? Over 1,000. Now, who would hazard a guess as of the beginning of 2011, which is the last time that I had a reliable statistic, how many wind installations by any manufacturer of China were installed in the US?
None.
3. And these are those 3. I happened to have a chance to visit. I was representing the National Committee for U.S. China Relations last November for their annual fan out across the U.S. and give town meetings event. And I went to South Dakota because they had an interest in clean energy. And while I was there, they were talking about, yeah, I think there was something that went on with a Chinese wind turbine somewhere around here. And it's just across the border in Minnesota. These were put in by Goldwind. And as I said, at the time, were the only 3 installations in the country. So think about the possibility for clumsy footwork on the global dance floor with China. If we react to what's going on in solar, but we overextend that to wind, and we basically say, what you guys are doing is totally unfair, and we're going to shut you out of the U.S. market for solar installations. We're going to shut you out of the U.S. market for wind. We're going to make you guys understand that this is unfair. We would be, under that scenario, putting a market of thousands of wind turbines in China in jeopardy for retaliation just because we haven't clearly conceptualized what the problem is. And I have faith that USTR would do much better than that. But the US government is driven by public opinion and voters. And at the level of public opinion and voters, we generally don't have a keen appreciation of how different some of these sectoral dynamics are. Very quickly, because I really want to get to Q&A with all of you, I would simply commend you, if you were going to read one thing about this topic other than my book, that you read Jim Fallows' article, The Future of Clean Energy is Dirty Coal. It's I'm sure many of you in this room have read the book. It's a absolutely trenchant and incisive analysis of what's at stake here, because in a nutshell, without trying to recapitulate all of Jim's argument, China is currently getting 70% of its energy from coal. U.S. is less than 50. It's been stable for some years, and it's been falling. In China, 30 years from now, they will still be getting 70% of their energy from coal because their growth trajectory demands it and no other source of supply can meet it. As a result of that basic inconvenient truth and uncomfortable fact, there is a huge effort to deploy the most sophisticated coal technologies in China. It's the name of this area of technology is enough to kind of drive you away, but it's called carbon capture and sequestration, CCS. And it basically, at various stages of the coal combustion process, it captures the carbon dioxide or the global greenhouse gas emission and does something with it. It can bury it deep, deep in the ground. The net effect is it doesn't let it get into the atmosphere. These are extremely expensive technologies. They are extremely cutting edge. The best research minds in North America, Europe, and China are all working on these. They are not market ready. You cannot make a profit, and there is virtually none of it happening on the ground in the United States. There are massive CCS installations throughout China. And these are in fact being somewhat funded by the U.S. either directly or indirectly through Asian Development Bank, World Bank. We need to keep our eye on the prize that CCS is a future industry in the creation, and we have, the United States has contributed the greatest number of patents to it. The theoretical knowledge essentially sprang from the US, but all the experience on the ground right now is happening in China. And we need, for everyone's benefit, to stay engaged with it. If we walk away from it, China will develop the greatest CCS technical capabilities in the world, and we would end up as also RANs. It will be better for everyone for us to stay engaged in an area that we helped pioneer, but that we have to be engaged with the Chinese on the ground, because given the complexity of regulations in North America and Europe, the only place where these are being deployed fast and where people are gaining direct practical experience is in China. So the final point in the body of my book just has to do with investment. And going back to the anthropological viewpoint, in each of these three sections of the book, politics, technology, investment, I really try to adopt the worldview of the practitioners of that particular discipline. So in talking about technology, inevitably there was discussion about kind of U.S. versus China and some of these competitive tensions. The investment community is remarkably different from the political community or the technology community. Politicians tend to think of the world in terms of national entities and competition or cooperation between national entities. Technology people are like scientists looking down a microscope, and they are intensely focused on their technology at the other end of that microscope. But while they're studying that technology, they're essentially screening out everything else in the world in order to focus on the technology. Investment people are like water, and they are ready to go globally wherever the conditions at that moment warrant the investment of their capital, wherever the conditions seem best. There's no particular loyalty in the global capital community to any particular nation state. There's not even a loyalty to a technology. A technology is only good. It doesn't matter how much the technology promises It's only good if it produces a return on investment. And a country is only good if it provides the investment regime that allows for that return on technology. And we, in our policy formulation process, and technologists need to understand that. And going back to the carbon capture and sequestration example from a moment ago, global capital is going to be attracted to China for exotic, advanced carbon capture technologies. That is where the action is. So, conclusions, such as they are. The first one is an extremely obvious one. The title, here we are in a political year in the US, and it's a political transition happening in China. Some people, when they hear the title of my book, say, what cooperation? But there is actually, as the book tries to tell the story, a very significant amount of cooperation that is currently going on between the US and China, and really only needs to grow given the scale of the problem. There was one bureaucratic effort that preceded the Obama administration, which was called the Energy Cooperation Program, that was started by the U.S. Trade Development Administration and is now run by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce out of their Beijing office. But at a larger level, after the Obama administration took power, there was a new program. The intellectual godfather of it was Michael Porter in Harvard. It was the idea that clusters and cooperation between academics, industry, and government are needed to help drive growth. Asia and Europe have picked up on Michael Porter's ideas for the last decades. It's a little bit the paradox of America that we provide the intellectual idea and then lag in putting it to practice. But the Brookings Institution and others, such as the Asia Society and the Pew Center for Climate Change, put together Michael Porter's thinking into what was called a roadmap for China. And they also developed a program called the Energy Innovation Hub program. It is the same program, but the Energy Innovation Hubs are for U.S. national centers, and as State mentioned, we have one of those now in Philadelphia. But as applied to the U.S.-China relationship, this is called the U.S. China Clean Energy Research Center Program, an appropriately long bureaucratic name, shortened frequently to CERC, C-E-R-C, for Clean Energy Research Centers. And these currently are paired institutions covering different areas. In Michigan, there is a cluster for electric vehicles that in China, its counterpart is in Wuhan. In Beijing. Tsinghua and Beijing, right. The clean coal one is in Wuhan. Sorry, thank you, Dennis. And sharing the same scope of work as our national center in Philadelphia, the Lawrence Berkeley Lab is also partnered with Tsinghua University for energy efficient building gains. Now, clearly there's competition too. I gave a couple of hot button examples of that competition in solar and wind, but it's really no different a model, and I know many of you know this already. It's an analogy that's frequently used, but it's like Google and Apple. They compete like hell with each other. There are areas that they cooperate with each other. The relationship is simply too complex to try to reduce it to a simple model of cooperation or competition. They both exist in spades. Now, at the end of surveying 10 different technology sectors, the book makes the very simple and straightforward recommendation that we think in terms of a global model of cooperation in clean energy area. The President Hu and President Obama created a framework for that cooperation in November 2009 when they signed the agreement to create the framework. But it actually needs actors, companies, trade associations, groups like Dennis Bracey's to actually do the work, to climb onto the platform, and to walk through the door of cooperation that's been created. And it is as simple as recognizing a partnership division of labor. The whole idea of partnership is that not everyone can do everything, that a team or a pair of people have natural strengths and natural weaknesses which are not identical to one another, and to figure out how to organize those strengths and weaknesses in a way that gets to a better result. In order to do so requires a realistic understanding of what your partner's strengths and weaknesses are. And in the case of the U.S. and China, it's really very simple. The U.S. is extraordinarily good at innovating. We do not bring our ideas to market with great speed or scale. Anyone who's had a mobile phone recognizes that over the long run, the U.S. market of introducing a technology does quite well. But it is sometimes frustrating as an American consumer when you go to a place like Europe or Asia, because that new phone standard will likely have been introduced from corner to corner of the country. Everywhere you go, it's seamless. The U.S. is a more market-driven, patchwork approach. The government doesn't really pick the winners or losers, and companies compete in different regions, and over time, good technology outcomes emerge. But we just don't do things in a top-down, blanket, overnight way, and we likely never will. There's an opportunity to take U.S. innovations to protect the intellectual property, which is the key to recognizing what our real asset in the partnership is, and to partner with deploying, testing, developing those technologies in China, and making sure that our innovators maintain their rightful part of the commercial benefits and are able to bring back improved understandings of how their technologies will work at a commercial level and introduce them successfully in other global markets without having that taken away from them by a Chinese competitor who has learned the technology inappropriately. But it's the scale and speed of the Chinese market that is their partnership asset, and it's the ingenuity and innovativeness of our market. And in sector after sector, we can work cooperatively and improve the IP protection protocols to achieve that partnership outcome. And finally, just because so much of the press is always about, is the sky falling? My personal conclusion at the end of the book, it's a little bit like the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, is that the depth and breadth of the U.S. capital markets are second to none. The ability to innovate technology is extraordinary. And the political system, this one's going to be a hard one for you to swallow today, but I would say in comparison with the Chinese system, because of the rooting, the fact that our political system is rooted in a 4-year exercise of people determining the outcomes of their own futures, that there's a sustainability, a potential for resilience and for regeneration that the U.S. system has. So the only things in what President Obama on February 3rd at State College, Pennsylvania, called the Sputnik moment for our generation with competition with China, the only things we need to really bring to it, beyond our capital markets, beyond our technology, and beyond our political system, we need to bring focus on what the issues are. We have to bring context to understanding the broad context of this complex story, and we have to bring realism. To end with just a plug for my individual effort, the Wilson Center was founded by a president who believed in the practitioner scholar, and the Woodrow Wilson Center, in furthering its mandate for knowledge in the public service, still has a special spot in its heart for practitioner scholars. And I'm trying to live to that ideal by working at the 13 county level in Philadelphia, similar to what Dennis has been doing in a Seattle-based effort, what Robert Wu has been doing in the Bay Area, what Peggy Liu has been doing in China. We have been trying to organize a 13-county area of southeastern Pennsylvania, southern New Jersey, and northern Delaware to mobilize to take advantage of the opportunity that Washington and Beijing have created through the U.S. China Clean Energy Research Center, or CERC, process. Both Philadelphia and Tianjin are cities that have a national mandate from their host governments to be at the national forefront in clean energy. The 12 five-year plan calls for Tianjin to be the deployment test bed on a national basis. Philadelphia, as we mentioned, has a $169 million energy-efficient building national hub. So it requires those subnational actors to get on the national platform, to walk through the door of cooperation, and that is what the Greater Philadelphia, the China Partnership of Greater Philadelphia has been trying to do. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Terry, for that very comprehensive presentation. Dr. Wekesser, do you have some comments?
Yes, thanks very much. First, let me just say that I'm here today not on behalf of my company, but on behalf of an organization based in Philadelphia called the Global Interdependence Center. You can find it on the web at interdependence.org, and several of my colleagues are here as well. We've been around since the middle 70s. I'm on the board, and we convene conferences globally on pressing issues of the day. For example, I just came back from Ghana in West Africa, where we had a conference on healthcare in developing countries. And my motivation for being here today is that we think that what Terry and the center have done here is so important. We're hoping that we can move toward institutionalizing a U.S. China conference on this subject to make it more and more public and bring more and more focus to it. And I'm honored to be here. Thank you very much. One of the things that I really liked about the book, Terry, was that you made every effort not to take sides and every effort not to point fingers, but just to try to capitalize on the new platform that's been created, and you're to be commended for that, and thank the center for its support. It's really a terrific effort. But one of the key observations that I would offer is that you said several times, and we've talked about this before, that the platform opens a door, but it still needs people to go through that door, and it needs people to get on the platform, so to speak. And as I read the book, I for some reason kept the old space race from the 60s kept popping into my mind, and I still old enough to still remember that when President Kennedy said, within 10 years, we're going to put a man on the moon. What he did by doing that was change everything. I mean, he changed all the relationships, he changed international relationships, and this was a unilateral move. But it really changed international dynamics as well. And it also set a very simple metric for success, like a light switch on or off. We either do it or we don't. What I would really like to see evolve in this platform are specific goals set at the top that would really drive things. I've felt for a long time that if the U.S. and China, for example, agreed, they said, we are going to, as an example, reduce oil consumption by X amount by X date, every relationship in the world would be changed. And it would set an instant metric for us to measure ourselves by. It would create tremendous risk and tremendous anxiety, but I think it would help to. Otherwise, I'm afraid that this platform, that the engine's not going to really get started unless we have these kinds of multinational or bilateral goals, and that the U.S. and China take the lead in establishing these and say, we are the world leaders and we're going to move in this direction and make it happen. Another observation is that you mentioned that U.S. brings the innovation aspect to the partnership, and China can bring the scaling to the partnership. But at the same time, it's absolutely remarkable how rapidly China has moved up the value chain over the last 20 years. And from a personal perspective, I can tell you we do market analysis in China, and we also actually knock on doors and sell products. And we've gone from, at this point in time, we look for very, very high-end, top-of-the-line manufactured products to sell in China. We can't sell anything else. I can't sell electronics in China. They make all the electronics in the world, both foreign companies in China making them and domestic companies in China making them. So we're looking only for things that are for which the competition is pretty limited, and the value add is very, very high and brand new to sell in China, because China has become so good at this. An example of this is the world of business incubators. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but this was invented in the U.S. I mean, we created the concept of business incubators to help small companies to create an environment where you limit the failure of small companies so that over time they will build a job base. They will create more jobs. Well, China jumped onto this in the early 90s, and today it has more business incubators than anybody in the world. That's not surprising in itself because it's such a huge country, but they have every kind. They've got biomedical incubators, they got materials science incubators, and in every city in China they have, they created what they call international business incubators, which is basically a euphemism for a home for expats. And I've been to several of them, and you walk down the hall and see companies on each side, and the companies read like a who's who in American universities. There's a guy here from Stanford who went back, and they're all going back to make their millions. So China is also getting really good at innovating, and in fact, I've always believed that the greatness of the United States comes from its ability to innovate, and that's frontier spirit. And I'm wondering if that challenge from China downstream is the biggest challenge that we're going to deal with. I might mention that I shared the platform a few weeks ago with the president of Bassett's Ice Cream, and this is interesting because this wouldn't have happened 10 years ago. Bassett's Ice Cream is a high-end ice cream that's made in the Philadelphia area, and they're exporting it to China as is, because they're creating an image of, a high-end product in China. The Chinese ice cream isn't very good to begin with, but this is at the very high end. This just wouldn't have happened 10 years ago. And we just completed a study in the e-vehicle market, a nationwide study for a U.S. and Italian company to see if there was any space in there for for this company to play, which there is, by the way. But what was extraordinary to me, and this is directly in line with what you were saying, Terry, was how China has, in the previous 5-year plan, they were not quite sure. They were waffling a little bit on what they were going to do with e-vehicles. But in this 5-year plan, they pulled out all the stops. There's going to be something between $15 and $20 billion invested. They're investing in both the supply side and the demand side. Will it work? I don't know. But when you've got 1.3 billion people all looking in the same direction, there's a very high probability that they will get this done. And what this means in terms of its competitive position with the U.S. is pretty clear, I think. A comment about the coal, you're quite right. What is interesting to me is that, because we've been in the coal and the mining industry, mining and power industry in China for many years, and China is putting unbelievable sums of money into alternative energy sources, as you know very well and point out so well in the book. And if you look at a pie chart, their goal is to reduce the amount of coal-generating power in terms of ratios, so that the piece of pie that's accounted for by coal will get smaller. But in fact, and it probably will, but in fact it's only going to get smaller by a few points, and the absolute number of coal consumption in terms of metric tons will increase. So it's a little bit deceptive to look at the piece of the pie, because in terms of absolute numbers, coal is increasing in coal consumption, not this year because it's got other problems, but overall by about 5% a year. Why? Because, as you pointed out, they've got the largest coal reserves in the world. They can't afford not to use them. But they are sincerely also working on clean energy techniques for clean burning techniques. And I want to reinforce also that Vestas story was very interesting, because the same thing has happened in the very big, heavy manufacturing world of turbines, and in general in the power industry. In fact, back in the late 80s and throughout the 90s, the big power manufacturers, Harbin Electric, Dongfeng, Shanghai Electric, there's about a half a dozen major turbine manufacturers in China. They all teamed up with Western companies. They teamed up with GE and Siemens, ABB, all the usual suspects. But today, there are still teaming efforts, but frankly, the Chinese have learned this technology now. And when you see the emergence of India down the street, their turbines are less coming from GE and ABB and Siemens than they are from China now, because we're actually bidding on projects that are going there and going into Indonesia and stuff. They've gotten really, really good at this. I think I'm going to wrap my comments up just right there and turn it back to you. But I think the final question that I have is, or I want to say again, I really hope that we can in due course get to the point where we actually have mutual specific goals for clean energy development, because I think that will change the world. It will change everybody's relationship. If we say we're going to do this, we're going to make it happen, and here's what the goal is, rather than just saying, let's get together and work on things. And it's yet to be seen whether a largely centrally planned economy and a largely market economy, although they're overlapping circles, how we do this, that's the real challenge, and that's where your book, I think, just makes a tremendous contribution, because you don't point fingers, you just try to identify the strengths and the weaknesses that we can try to put together to make this all work. Thanks very much.
Thank you for those comments. I was struck by your comment about innovation. We at the Kissinger Institute did a symposium on innovation with the Counselor's Office of the State Council in China, a series of symposia that we've been doing, but the topic this year was innovation. And we not only had discussions here in Washington, but we took them out to some of our innovation centers, including the Media Lab up at MIT and the Innovation Center at Harvard University. The Chinese minds were blown away, partly because they were struck by the degree to which innovation is built into American culture. And in China, the government has very active innovation projects, but they haven't yet embedded it in the culture. But I think your point that they're coming up fast in this area is very accurate, and it indicates exactly what the challenge of China is to us. We have an edge in so many different areas, which we're losing because we're not keeping up, shall we say, with the international competition.
Can I just make another quick comment on that? It's a bit of a mystery to me where the entrepreneurs and the innovation in China actually springs from. But you know, the second the door was open, there were shops lining the streets in Beijing and Shanghai and so on. These guys come out of the woodwork, and it's almost as though it's a genetic trait or something, and I don't understand it, because certainly under Mao, if there was a nail sticking up, you hammered it down. There was no room for any kind. But the instant the door was open, they appeared everywhere.
Well, anthropologists and historians have actually tackled that one, and I think the general consensus is that there was such a high degree of arbitrariness in the imperial system in the 16th and 17th centuries that Chinese culture internalized a family-based system of entrepreneurialism that was not dependent on imperial whim, but that was very focused on making money and succeeding as a family enterprise.
Well, we have about 10 minutes for questions and answers, if there are any. So let's open the floor. Begin over here.
Excuse me, sorry.
Please identify yourselves.
Sure.
Yeah.
Michael Nix, energy consultant here in town. Dr. Cook, very much enjoyed that. Two questions. Alstom, the French company, doing a lot of CCS work, doing some CCS work here. They did a pilot project with American Electric Power in West Virginia. Who's doing stuff in China? Is it Alstom? Are there other companies that we might know? Secondly, shale gas, huge issue here, changing the way we generate electricity, or the fuel source mix that we use for electricity generation here. Issue in China or not?
Terry, we're running out of time, so please keep your...
Very quick answers. The U.S. CCS market, there are players, but Duke had been a leader, and a lot of wind came out of the U.S. sail with the recent leadership transition at Duke. All of the major Western countries are involved in China, anyone you've named or could imagine. On shale gas, there are some promising signs for shale gas, but in China, the extent of its reserves is not as clearly identified in China as we have with the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania and then the big Texas deposit. So they're still trying to get a handle on how much there is. Some of the natural gas quality in China has not been as high as world standard, so they need to kind of get a handle on the quality of their gas. And then thirdly, there's a big bottleneck with water, because China is one of the most water-constrained countries in the world, and you need water for the fracking extraction technology.
We had a question over here? Yes, ma'am.
Good morning. My name is Sharon Shin. I'm with the National Wildlife Federation, and I have two questions. And I know we're running out of time, so please feel free to respond to either one of them. The first one is that you mentioned that the U.S. asset in the clean energy sector is the ability to innovate. And what is your take on what the U.S. government should do to strengthen intellectual property protection in China? And the second question is that just placing the Clean Energy Cooperation in a larger picture of U.S.-China relations, the clean energy field is actually one of the very few fields that the two countries can actually reach agreements. And is this a good reason for us to be sanguine about the future of U.S.-China clean energy cooperation? Thank you.
Well, very telegraphically, I'll try to tackle both. The second one first. Bill Chandler has put more pithily than anyone that essentially the U.S. and China are in a joint suicide pact situation if they don't come to grips with this issue. So I think crisis does focus the minds. I hope over time that there will be an ability for the two countries to dance together in an elegant way and not on a clumsy way on the global stage of clean energy cooperation. On the intellectual property right issue, we could easily spend a whole session or longer on that topic. I would simply say that Dennis Bracey has been extremely active in trying to help develop protocols for intellectual property between the U.S. and China in the clean energy area. President Hu and Obama themselves, in their formal agreement, there was a level of intellectual property right protection built into that, but that's at such a high level it doesn't offer much comfort to an individual company. In our local effort in Philadelphia, we have actually tried to also bring in law firms from both Tianjin and Philadelphia to help coach companies before problems happen as to what to look for and to offer a mediation mechanism should things start to go wrong. But it's an extremely important area to get right. Otherwise, trust gets eroded.
Did you have a question?
Thank you. Hi, Cecilia Springer, former Fulbright scholar in Tianjin. I have a question about, in your book, you mentioned that there's been a recent proliferation of Chinese projects that are essentially labeled as eco and low carbon cities, zones, things like that. And you said that this is because Chinese party officials are being evaluated now by environmental indicators as well as economic. And I'm wondering if you can share some insight as to whether that's an international push. Are they feeling subject to scrutiny from the climate negotiations, international influence, orienting towards this U.S. Clean energy partnership? Or is it more of a domestic recognition of environmental problems? If you could just share some insight as to this.
Excellent question. My answer is actually a little bit sensitive. I do know that there is press in the room. I want to just say that this is an individual opinion, and it's nothing more than an individual opinion. But I don't think that the driver is international. I don't think the primary driver is international pressure, though the Chinese are very aware and are trying to be responsive to international pressure. I think it is a recognition at the leadership level about the costs of environmental pollution to the political evolution of other countries around its periphery. And for instance, to take one, Taiwan in the 1960s suffered a series of devastating industrial accidents where many of their citizens died. And it was in some ways the initial seeds of Taiwanese democratization, because as people learned that their government had not been telling them the truth about why their children had died or why they had life-changing diseases, it changed the relationship between the polity and the government. And I think China is mindful that they have paid a very high cost in their economic development through environmental degradation, and that their own ability to maintain power depends on taking steps to address it. And so for that reason, the personnel system, which used to be geared 100% towards economic metrics for an individual's official's performance, is now thought to be roughly 70% economic, 30% environmental. And that is the driver for the phenomenon I tried to describe in the book. Because if you're a smart, ambitious official and you go, okay, 70% of my promotion is going to be dependent on economics, 30% environmental, how about if I do something that gives me credit for both? And eco-cities are essentially a way of getting credit for both.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Sort of bringing it back in the adult way.
Here comes a.
Your message focused at the end.
Please
on,
identify yourself.
Oh, I'm Eleanor Bastian. I work for Congresswoman Diana DeGette. You at the end, you focused on innovation and speed and scale. And for leaders in Congress, which is, traditionally seen as sort of the attack dog on China, and for the administration, which tries to, counter that a bit, how can you connect that message with the issues with our domestic economy and our ideas that we need to create jobs? How do we connect the innovation and speed and scale to millions and millions of jobs here?
Not in a partisan sense, red-blue, but in perhaps a partisan sense, being a native of Philadelphia. I think the energy hub undertaking is 100% focused on investment attraction and job creation. The idea is that once the energy hub in Philadelphia figures out how to bring about that order of magnitude of energy savings in the microclimate of the Mid-Atlantic region, and in partnership with the local real estate community, that they can then scale that experience nationally to other microclimates and to other business communities around the country. So it is 100%, the success of the Energy Hub program is 100% based on jobs and investment promotion, and it has a national scaling mechanism built into it, but it just has to prove itself on a local level first.
Thank you very much. I think that we have gained some insights into the enormous potential for cooperation between China and the United States in clean energy areas, which is both important in terms of the bilateral relationship, but also important because of the significance of clean energy itself. As somebody who's lived for years in China, as you and others have, I completely agree with Dr. Cook that it's the domestic pressures that are driving China's interest in clean energy, not the international pressures. The health consequences for China, even 20 years ago when I was serving in China, the top officials were very conscious of the longer-term consequences of the deteriorating environment in China. And I think Dr. Wekesser made a very important point, that even if the pie chart shrinks in terms of the role of coal in China, the absolute emissions coming from the coal-fired power plants, which are essential to China's continuing development, are going to worsen the environment, and therefore it's going to get worse before it gets better. And that is a very disturbing factor because China already has a high percentage of the most polluted cities in the world, cities with massive populations living in them. I would go out and jog in the morning in Beijing 20 years ago, and I'd come back, my teeth would be coated with coal dust, literally. Thank you. Could you join me in thanking Dr. Cook and Dr. Wekesser?
And as a final comment, I'd like to thank you all for your time.